Maya Coleman was 11 years old, and she already knew how to count money in her head faster than most adults. Not because she loved numbers, she knew it because she had to. Every week, her mother Denise would leave a small list of bills on the kitchen counter, and Maya would look at it before she even opened the fridge, just to know how careful she had to be with snacks that week. They lived on the third floor of an old building on Eastbrook Avenue, in an apartment with a window that didn't close all the way, and a radiator that banged like someone was knocking from inside the wall. It wasn't much, but it was warm enough, most nights, and it smelled like whatever Denise had managed to cook before her shift, and that was enough for Maya. She wasn't the kind of kid who complained about what she didn't have. She'd learned early that complaining didn't fix anything. Working did. Denise worked at Eastbrook General Hospital, in the laundry department, washing sheets and gowns and towels that came back from every floor of the building, some of them stained in ways Maya didn't want to think too hard about. It wasn't a job people respected much, but it paid, and it came with something Denise valued more than most people realized. She got to walk through the hospital sometimes, just for a few minutes, on her way to drop off carts, and she'd pass nurses moving fast, doctors talking in low voices, machines beeping steady and calm. She liked that world. She liked how everyone there had a job that mattered, even the smallest one. Maya picked that habit up from her, somehow, without anyone teaching it to her on purpose. Whenever her mother got home late and tired, Maya would ask her questions. What does that machine do? Why do nurses write things down so much? What happens if someone's heart stops? Denise didn't always know the answers, but she'd guess, and sometimes she'd bring home little pamphlets from the hospital, the kind meant for patients, just because Maya liked reading them. "You're going to be a nurse one day," Denise told her once, only half joking, while folding laundry on their old couch. "Watch. You already act like one." Maya had laughed it off then, but she didn't forget it. That part of the story matters, because without it, what happened later in that alley might have gone very differently. The night it happened started like any other Thursday. School had let out at 3. Maya had stayed an extra hour for a after-school reading club, mostly because they gave out free snacks, and she liked the quiet of the library better than the noise of home before her mother got back. By the time she left, the sky outside had already turned that heavy gray color that usually meant rain was coming, and coming fast. She had one job that evening: stop at the corner store, get a few things for dinner, and have something started on the stove by the time Denise walked in from her shift at 8. It wasn't a big list. Rice, a can of beans, a few onions, maybe something sweet if there was enough left over. Simple stuff. The kind of errand Maya had done 100 times before without anyone thinking twice about it. The rain started while she was still in the store, tapping lightly on the window, the kind of rain that looks soft from inside but turns out to be much heavier once you're standing in it. By the time she paid and stepped outside, it was coming down hard, fast drops that stung a little against her skin, and the wind had picked up enough to push her hair into her face. Normally, Maya took the long way home, down the main street, past the bus stop and the laundromat with the flickering sign. Her mother had told her more times than she could count never to cut through the back alley behind the pharmacy, especially once it got dark. "Bad things happen in places nobody's watching," Denise always said. Maya had always listened, until that night. That night, the main street was blocked. A delivery truck had stalled right in front of the pharmacy, half on the sidewalk, with its hazard lights blinking weakly through the rain, and a small crowd of annoyed people were trying to figure out how to get around it. Maya stood there for a second, soaked, holding a paper bag that was already starting to give way at the bottom from the wet, and she thought about her mother's warning. Then she thought about the time. It was already past 7:30. If she didn't get moving, dinner wouldn't be ready, and her mother would come home exhausted to a cold stove, which somehow always made Maya feel worse than any scolding could. So she made the choice. Just this once, she told herself. Just to save time. She turned down the narrow side path that led behind the pharmacy, the one everyone called the alley, even though it was really just a service road between two buildings, lined with dumpsters and the kind of shadows that swallowed streetlight before it could reach the ground. She walked fast, head down against the rain, the paper bag clutched tight to her chest. The alley smelled like wet concrete and old garbage, and her sneakers splashed through puddles she couldn't see until she was already in them. She was maybe halfway through when something made her slow down. It wasn't a sound. It was more like a feeling, the kind you get when something in a familiar picture is slightly wrong, even before your eyes can explain why. She looked toward the wall near the second dumpster, and at first her brain tried to tell her it was nothing, just a pile of wet clothes, or a stack of boxes someone had left out. Then she saw the shoes, expensive ones, the kind she'd only ever seen in store windows downtown, completely out of place against the cracked pavement. And above the shoes, a man, slumped sideways against the brick wall, one leg bent underneath him in a way that looked painful, even from a distance. Maya's first instinct, the one her mother had drilled into her, was to keep walking. Don't stop for strangers. Don't get involved. Get home. But something about the stillness of him stopped her feet before her brain could finish the thought. She took a few careful steps closer. The man was older, maybe in his 60s, wearing a long gray coat that was soaked completely through, his gray hair plastered flat against his head from the rain. His face had a strange color to it, not quite the normal color of skin, more like something had drained out of it. His lips looked faintly blue, and on his wrist, half covered by his sleeve, she caught the glint of a silver watch, the kind that looked like it cost more than everything in her apartment combined. "Sir," she said, her voice barely loud enough to hear over the rain. "Sir, are you okay?" Nothing. No movement. No answer. She crouched down next to him slowly, the paper bag forgotten now, water soaking through the knees of her jeans without her even noticing. Up close, she could hear something, a faint, uneven sound, like breathing, but wrong, too shallow, too slow, like his body was forgetting how to do something it had done automatically every second of his life until now. "Open your eyes, sir," she said again, louder this time, shaking his shoulder gently the way she'd seen nurses do in shows her mother liked to watch during her rare days off. "Please, can you hear me? Open your eyes." He didn't move, not even a flicker. For a few seconds, Maya just stayed frozen there, rain running down her face, her heart pounding louder than she'd ever felt it pound before. Every instinct in her body wanted to run, to get away from whatever this was, because 11-year-olds are not supposed to find grown men lying still in alleys. But another part of her, the part that had spent years asking her mother questions about hospitals and listening carefully to every answer, was already working. She remembered something Denise had told her once, almost as a side comment while folding towels. If someone's not waking up and their breathing sounds strange, that's serious. That's not a wait-and-see kind of thing. That's a get-help-right-now kind of thing. Maya didn't have a phone. Kids on her street usually didn't get one until middle school, and even then, only if their family could afford it. So she did the only thing she could think to do. She stood up and ran to the mouth of the alley, scanning the street through the rain until she spotted a man locking up the front gate of a small bodega a few doors down. "Please," she said, breathless, grabbing his sleeve without thinking. "There's a man back there. He's not waking up. Please call 911, please." The bodega owner, an older man with tired eyes and a kind face, didn't waste time asking questions. He pulled his phone out immediately and dialed, already moving toward the alley as he spoke to the dispatcher, describing what little Maya had managed to tell him. Maya ran back ahead of him. She crouched down beside the man again, and this time, without really thinking about whether it made sense, she pulled off her soaked jacket and laid it over his chest, like that small, useless gesture might somehow help keep whatever warmth he had left inside him. "Help is coming," she told him, her voice shaking now, more from fear than cold. "Don't go anywhere, okay? Just stay. Stay with me. Open your eyes." He didn't, not in those minutes. The wait felt impossibly long, the kind of long where every second stretches out and refuses to move forward, but in reality it was probably only 6 or 7 minutes before she heard the sirens, faint at first, then closer, until red and blue light started bouncing off the wet brick walls around them. The paramedics moved fast once they arrived, kneeling beside the man, checking his pulse, talking to each other in short, clipped sentences full of numbers and words Maya didn't understand. One of them pressed something under the man's nose, and a second later, his chest rose with a sharp, gasping breath, and his eyes opened, confused, unfocused, but open. Maya stood off to the side, soaked through, shivering, watching as they lifted him carefully onto a stretcher. For a brief second his eyes drifted toward her, glassy and unsure, like he was trying to understand what he was looking at. Then the paramedics were moving, wheeling him toward the ambulance, and the bodega owner was gently guiding Maya back, telling her it was okay now. They had him. She could go home. She picked her soaked, ruined groceries off the wet ground. Half the bag had given out completely, the can of beans rolling into a puddle, and started the walk home, alone, in the rain, her mind racing too fast to fully process what had just happened. When she finally got home, soaked and shaking, Denise was already there, pacing near the window, worried sick, because Maya was almost an hour late and the storm outside had only gotten worse. The second Denise saw her daughter's face, she knew something had happened. Maya told her everything, sitting at the kitchen table wrapped in a dry towel, her voice still a little unsteady. Denise listened without interrupting, her hand pressed against her mouth through most of it, and when Maya finished, her mother pulled her into a hug so tight it almost hurt. "You did the right thing," Denise whispered into her hair. "You did exactly the right thing. Am I in trouble? For taking the alley?" Denise pulled back just enough to look at her daughter's face. "We'll talk about the alley later," she said softly. "Tonight, I'm just glad you're home." Neither of them knew, that night, just how far that one decision in the rain was about to travel. What Maya didn't know, what she had no way of knowing, was that the man she'd found was named Walter Ashford Greer, and that his name was attached to companies most people had heard of, even if they didn't know his face. He wasn't the kind of person who showed up on the news for personal stories. He was the kind of person who showed up in headlines about business deals, stock prices, and donations to causes that made for good press releases. Behind closed doors, though, Walter's life had quietly become something much smaller and lonelier than his bank account would ever suggest. He had built his company from almost nothing, decades earlier, starting with a small idea and a stubborn refusal to give up on it, even when most people around him thought he should. Over the years, that stubbornness had paid off in ways even he hadn't fully expected. But somewhere along the way, the thing that had once felt exciting, building something, growing something, proving something, had turned into a kind of constant, exhausting motion that never really stopped. Meetings bled into more meetings. Cities blurred together. He had a driver, an assistant, a small team of people whose entire job was to manage his schedule down to the minute, and somewhere in all that careful management, Walter had quietly stopped having a life that belonged only to him. That evening he had finished a meeting that ran much longer than expected, the kind of meeting filled with tense silences and careful words, the kind that left him with a headache pressing behind his eyes by the time it ended. His driver was waiting outside, as always. But for reasons Walter himself couldn't fully explain afterward, he told the driver to go ahead without him. He wanted to walk, just for a little while, just to feel like a regular person moving through a regular evening, even with the storm rolling in. It wasn't a smart decision, he knew that, even as he made it, but something in him needed those 10 minutes more than he needed to be careful that night. He never made it back to his car. Later, in the hospital, doctors would explain to him that he had an irregular heartbeat condition he hadn't known he had, made worse by years of poor sleep, constant stress, and a body that had been running on empty for longer than he wanted to admit. The combination, paired with the cold and the rain that night, had triggered a sudden, dangerous drop in his heart's rhythm. He had collapsed in that alley with almost no warning, and if help hadn't reached him when it did, the doctors told him plainly he likely wouldn't have survived the night. When Walter woke up properly, a full day later, in a hospital bed with wires taped to his chest and a soft, steady beeping nearby. The first thing he asked wasn't about his business, or his missed meetings, or the messages already piling up from people who needed something from him. The first thing he asked was about the girl. The paramedics had mentioned her briefly in their report. A young girl, they said, who had flagged down help and stayed with him until they arrived. Nobody had gotten her name. In the chaos of the rain and the emergency, nobody had thought to ask. Walter couldn't stop thinking about her. It surprised even him how much it bothered him. He had people around him every day whose entire job was to handle problems, to make things happen, to get him whatever he wanted with a phone call. And yet here was something money couldn't simply buy back. A moment, a stranger, a kindness given freely in the rain by someone who had nothing to gain from it. He told his assistant, as soon as he was well enough to speak clearly, that he wanted to find her. Not for a headline, not for a photo. He didn't want any of that, and he made that very clear, more than once, to everyone around him. He just wanted to thank her. It took weeks. His security team pulled what little camera footage existed near that alley, most of it grainy, half blocked by rain and shadow, showing almost nothing useful. They canvassed nearby buildings, the pharmacy, a few apartment complexes, asking questions that mostly led nowhere. Walter even offered a reward at one point, which backfired a little, bringing forward a handful of people suddenly claiming to remember details that didn't quite add up. It was the bodega owner, eventually, the same man who had called 911 that night, who gave them the one solid lead that mattered. He remembered a girl, young, maybe 10 or 11, soaked from the rain, carrying a grocery bag that had been falling apart by the end. He remembered she'd been wearing a jacket with some kind of patch on it, a school logo, though he couldn't recall the exact design after all this time. That small detail was enough. A patch, a neighborhood, a rough age range. From there, with careful, respectful outreach through the right channels, rather than anything that felt like an invasion, Walter's Foundation reached out to a few local schools, not with Walter's name attached directly, but as part of what was framed simply as an effort to recognize a student involved in a community emergency call. It was Maya's school that responded. When the call eventually came to Denise, she almost didn't believe it. A representative from a charitable foundation, asking carefully worded questions about whether her daughter had been involved in helping someone the night of a recent storm. Denise, cautious by nature, asked a dozen questions of her own before agreeing to anything. But slowly, piece by piece, the story matched. Maya, for her part, had mostly stopped thinking about that night, at least on the surface. Life had gone back to its normal rhythm: school, chores, helping her mother, the small routines that filled up her days. But sometimes, late at night, she'd think about the man's face, pale and still, and wonder, quietly, if he had made it. When Denise finally sat her down and explained that the man had survived and that he wanted to meet her, Maya's first reaction wasn't excitement. It was relief, the kind that made her eyes sting unexpectedly. "He's okay," she asked. "He's okay," Denise said. "Because of you." The meeting, when it finally happened, was nothing like what either of them expected. There were no cameras, no reporters, no grand entrance. Walter insisted on that, firmly, against the advice of more than one person on his team who thought a public moment might do good for both his image and his foundation's visibility. He didn't care. This wasn't about that, and he made sure everyone around him understood it. He came to their apartment on a quiet Saturday afternoon, alone except for one driver waiting outside in the car, dressed simply, none of the polish people usually expected from him. He sat at their small kitchen table, the same table where Maya did her homework every night, across from Denise, who held her coffee cup with both hands the entire time, like she needed something steady to hold on to. For a moment, nobody said much of anything. Then Walter looked at Maya, really looked at her, and his voice came out rougher than he meant it to. "You saved my life," he said simply. Maya, who had spent the past few months quietly worried she might somehow be in trouble, for taking the alley, for the ruined groceries, for not calling her mother first before doing anything, only shrugged a little, unsure what to say to something so big. "You weren't waking up," she said finally. "I didn't really do much. I just got people who could help." "That's not nothing," Walter said, shaking his head slightly. "That's the whole thing, actually. That's everything." He didn't bring a check that day, though plenty of people later assumed that's how stories like this always end. What he offered instead was something far less flashy and far more lasting: time, attention, and an open door. He asked questions, real questions, about Maya's life, her school, what she liked, what she hoped for. When Denise mentioned, almost in passing, that Maya had always talked about wanting to become a nurse someday, inspired by all those afternoons spent listening in the hospital break room, something in Walter's expression shifted. "She already sounds like one," he said quietly. Over the following months, things began to change, slowly and carefully, in a way that never felt like charity thrown at them from above, but more like a door quietly opening that hadn't been there before. A scholarship fund was set up, not with Walter's name plastered across it, but routed quietly through his foundation, the kind of arrangement designed specifically so it wouldn't draw cameras or attention to an 11-year-old girl's school. It covered tuition possibilities Maya hadn't even let herself dream about before: better schools, tutoring, eventually, years down the line, a real path toward nursing school, without the constant fear of how her family would ever afford it. But more than the money, what stuck with Maya over the years that followed was something simpler. Walter kept showing up, in small, steady ways. He didn't try to become some kind of substitute father figure, and he was careful never to overstep that line. But he checked in. He asked about her grades. He remembered small details she mentioned in passing: a science project she was nervous about, a friend she'd had a falling out with, a book she couldn't put down. It wasn't constant, and it wasn't overwhelming. It was steady, the way a person shows up when they actually mean it. For Maya, the change wasn't really about the scholarship or the mentorship program that eventually grew out of all this, helping dozens of other kids from her neighborhood find their own paths toward nursing and medical careers. The real change was something quieter, something that lived inside her rather than around her. On hard days at school, during the brutal stretch of exams years later when she was preparing for nursing school entrance tests, she'd remind herself of one simple fact whenever doubt crept in. She already knew she could keep her head when it mattered most. She'd proven it once, in the rain, to a stranger who couldn't even hear her at the time. Walter changed too, in ways that had nothing to do with money or business. He started taking those quiet 10-minute walks again after long meetings, the kind that had nearly cost him everything that night. But never alone anymore, and never without telling someone exactly where he'd be. His relationship with his own health shifted as well. He saw doctors regularly now, something he'd avoided for years out of sheer stubbornness and busyness, and he slowly, deliberately built more space into a life that had once been packed wall to wall with obligations. And every year, on the date of that storm, a card arrived at Maya's home. Never a check, just a card, handwritten in Walter's own uneven handwriting, always carrying some version of the same simple message: "Thank you for telling me to open my eyes." Maya kept every single one of them, tucked carefully into a small box in her room, a quiet reminder of a night that had started with nothing more than a late grocery run in the rain, and had somehow turned into something neither of them could have predicted. Years later, when Maya finally stood in her nursing school uniform for the first time, looking at her reflection in the mirror, she thought back to that alley more than once. Not with fear, the way she sometimes expected she might, but with a strange, quiet kind of gratitude. For the storm, for the wrong turn, for the moment she chose to stop instead of walking past. Some people spend their whole lives waiting for a single defining moment to prove who they really are. Maya found hers at 11 years old, crouched in the rain beside a stranger, refusing to leave until help arrived. And Walter Greer, a man who had spent decades building something enormous out of nothing, learned something from a child that none of his success had ever managed to teach him on its own, that sometimes the most valuable thing in the world isn't something you build, it's someone who simply chooses not to walk away.